This will be the video lecture for the competition and coexistence. Alright, what are competition and coexistence? Those are interactions between organisms. And we can basically break them down into three rough categories. Interactions where they're good for both organisms benefit. Interactions where it's good for one, but the other one isn't harmed or doesn't care or doesn't notice. Or where it benefits one, in other words, it's good for one, but the other one is harmed. So let's talk a little bit about mutualism. The most common one is going to be symbiosis, and that's a coexistence that benefits both organisms. So here are some examples. Lichen, the algae and the fungi that make up different lichens could not survive without the other. Mycorrhizae, fungi and plants. Plants have these interactions with various fungi that allows them to have access to more nutrients that they would not have access to otherwise. Pollination, that benefits both the plants and the insects. We're dealing with other types of mutualism, however, and obligate mutualism is absolutely critical to both. Or it could be facultative mutualism, which is beneficial to one or both, but it's not absolutely essential to them. So here are some examples of obligate mutualism. Basically, almost all pollination is going to be obligate, meaning that the plants need this. They can't reproduce without the insects, but it might not necessarily be that particular species. So does this flower need this exact bee? The flower needs bees, the bees need the flowers. So it is an obligate mutualism. They can't survive without each other, but do they need that exact species of bee? There are some where you do need that, and yucca moths are an example of that. Here's the yucca moth. It's not the most pretty thing. It's absolutely dependent, however, on the yucca. It's a strange partnership. The yucca requires the moth for pollination. The yucca's larvae cannot survive unless they're on the yucca. Here's some examples of more facultative mutualism. You see the ants over on the left-hand side, and they are farming these aphids. The aphids can survive without the ants. The ants can actually survive without the aphids. Neither one is hurting each other one. But the ants will farm them, will hoard them together, will protect them from other insects, and they eat the honeydew that the ants secrete. So the ants benefit. But it's absolutely not essential that the ants farm these aphids. Same thing with birds or other animals and fruit. Are there other ways that trees and plants can distribute their fruit? Absolutely. But the birds are helpful because the birds are going to take the seeds further away. So that might reduce competition. The plant doesn't need the bird, but it helps. We do have some other examples. Commensalism is where one benefits, but the other doesn't care at all. Right? This is an example here of an epiphyte. Most epiphytes grow on trees. This one is growing on a brick wall. It happens to be vanilla. They're growing it at the National Botanic Garden just so folks can see it. Normally they grow on the tree trunks. They're not hurting the tree. The tree could care less that it's there. But the vanilla, it's absolutely essential for the vanilla to climb to be able to reach light. Here's another example of that. This is a staghorn fern growing attached to a palm tree. The staghorn absolutely benefits from this. It's up out of competition's way. It's up out of the way of predators or herbivores that might eat it. It's access to more light simply because it's attached a little bit higher on the tree trunk. The palm could care less. It doesn't even notice that staghorn fern is there. A lot of orchids are like this. So here you can actually see the orchid roots clinging to a tree trunk, but they aren't in the tree trunk. So they're not harming the tree. In fact, the tree could care less that they're there. What about this? This would possibly be a little bit tricky. Technically, the grass is a little harmed by the grazing. There is damage that occurs, but it mostly doesn't care because it continues to grow. The way grass grows is if you lop the top off, it can continue to grow. So the sheep benefits and the grass mostly doesn't care. One could argue that both benefit in the long run because proper grazing can keep your weeds out and keep your grasses healthy. Some other relationships that occasionally we see, parasitic is probably the one that we see the most in terms of the plant world. The plant on the left, the yellow, looks like yellow shoestrings, that's called daughter. Notice there's no chlorophyll. It cannot photosynthesize at all. It is a plant that cannot photosynthesize. So what it does is it digs tiny little roots into other plants and it steals the nutrients from them. So it parasitizes them. The one on the right, that's mistletoe. Yes, the mistletoe that we use at Christmas time. They are also parasites, and they root into trees to steal water and nutrients from the host plant. They can photosynthesize on their own. Notice that plant is green, so it is capable of photosynthesizing, but it prefers to let the tree do all the work in terms of getting the nutrients in the water. We do see plants competing with other plants, and this is the type of interaction that we often see in our landscapes, in our fields, in our greenhouses, where they're competing with each other for light, for minerals, for water, for space. It's kind of an indirect competition in the sense that we're forcing it. We try to space the plants so that they're not really competing with each other. So this is something that we do have to deal with in our agronomic and our horticultural systems. Now, we have intraspecific competition within a species and interspecific competition between species. So how does this affect our cropping systems? In a landscape, we simply space so that hopefully there isn't a whole lot of competition. We can grow shade plants under trees. We know that the tree roots are a lot deeper, so the plants that tolerate the shade can be underneath those trees, and they're not really interfering with each other a whole lot. You do have to be careful with the species of tree because, for example, maples have a lot more surface roots than oaks do. We try to avoid aggressive plants. We don't want plants in our garden that are going to run rampant. But what do we do in our crops? We try to prevent other species from being in our crops. Some of that is actually due to ease of harvest. In fact, a lot of that is going to be due to ease of harvest. But are there situations where we grow crops together? That's one possibility. So normally we do crop rotation. So if you look at the right-hand side of things, that's pretty much how we see corn and soybeans. You don't usually see them in the field at the same time. You know, the next year you might rotate the location of those two crops. The challenge sometimes with that is corn as a weed, the random volunteer corn plants coming up in your soybean plants. If you have about 4% corn plants in your field, we can actually notice an up to 10% reduction in the soybeans with corn. That's how aggressive corn is. That's how efficient it is. But we're seeing some people say, what if we grow them at the same time? So we're saying maybe what we can do is grow them at the same time. The trick with this is to get the right varieties. And not all varieties are going to work with this. And this is where you're planting your crops and your soybeans purposely together. You have to get the right cultivars of corn and soybeans because you've got to make sure that soybean is fast enough and big enough to compete with the corn, or it will be outcompeted. It's not something that we see very commonly, but we are seeing small-scale farmers try this occasionally. Carbon dioxide is something that plants actually have to compete for. This is not something that plants are competing for outside. Obviously, it's not limiting. But inside, it certainly can be limited. Internal carbon dioxide inside the plant absolutely can be limiting. So this looks like a really complicated graph, but it's not. What we're actually looking at is plants breathing. So this is the concentration of carbon dioxide at different times underneath leaves, under two different conventional tillage or no-till. But you're seeing the same basic graph. So the plants use all the carbon dioxide so very little carbon dioxide. Then they rest a little bit and the carbon dioxide builds back up underneath the leaves. Then they use it all again. Then it builds back up and then they use it all again. So what we're seeing is basically the plants utilizing all the carbon dioxide near their leaves, the atmosphere filling it back in, the plants using it up, the atmosphere filling it back in again. So the graph isn't as complicated as it might seem. We know that there's a certain amount of plants we can get into the field, and once we go over that, we're actually reducing the yield of those plants. So that's what we're looking at. How many plants can we put in the field? We could get more plants in our field and maybe have fewer resources per plant. We could have more plants in the field and maybe we have smaller plants. But what we're looking for is the way to get the best amount of spacing and the most amount of growth. Whereas if we start spacing them closer and closer and closer, growth is reduced. We're trying not to do that. Plants occasionally do things to prevent us from harming them or prevent other plants from harming them. Allelopathy is a plant putting chemicals into the soil that are toxic to other species of plants. The plant makes caffeine so that other things won't eat it, so that other plants can't use that soil. There's a walnut tree in a field, and look underneath it, the number of species that are underneath that plant relative to the number of species that are far away from that plant. So if you look away from the canopy, there's actually more species of plants. Now, it's not that they kill everything. There's still plants underneath there, but you have to find plants that are capable of growing underneath it. Look at these weeds. Quackgrass, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, Canada thistle, bindweed. A lot of these weeds, we're thinking they're actually producing chemicals to kill other plants. It's one of the reasons that some of these weeds show up on all of those noxious weed lists. Plants will also produce secondary metabolites. This protects them from predation. Subterranean clover produces estrogen. Estrogen will prevent other insects from eating them. Caffeine is toxic to insects and fungi. Nicotine is a biocide. It's a response that the plant makes to wounding. Now, we've managed to turn that chemical into something useful, but the plant actually makes it so other insects try not to eat it.
Plants face a number of threats from their environments, such as weather and insects. Now, University of Missouri researchers have found that plants can defend themselves from insect threats simply by hearing the threat. Using a special laser microphone, the MU scientists recorded the vibrations, or sounds, of caterpillars chewing on plant leaves. They then played those chewing sounds to plants before allowing caterpillars to eat the leaves of the plants.
What we found was that having been exposed to those vibrations, those chewing vibrations for a few hours, primed the plants so that when they were attacked by caterpillars, they responded with much higher levels of these mustard oils that are toxic to caterpillars.
Knowing that plants can respond to threats in such a manner can help scientists find ways to better protect plants, such as food crops, from insect pests.
Understanding how plants detect and respond to sounds in their environment provides us with new ways to help plants defend themselves against their insect pests. It also opens the window a little wider on plant behavior, showing us that plants respond to things in their environment in ways similar to animals, even though the actual responses might look a little different.
The MU scientists plan to continue to study exactly how these plants sense the vibrations from insects. This study was funded by the National Science Foundation. For the MU News Bureau, I'm Nathan Hurst.
So that goes to show us that plants actually have a far greater response to their environment than we might think. Take-home message here, though, is that we are trying to maximize beneficial relationships while minimizing the negative ones. That's why plants are spaced in a certain way in your field. That's why they're spaced a certain way in your greenhouse. That's why when you buy annuals and perennials, it'll say space them this far apart so that we're reducing that competition. We're trying to maximize good relationships and minimize the bad ones. As always, if you have questions, do not hesitate to get in touch.